Hi everyone, my name is Ryan,
And my name is Travis.
and welcome to our wisdom adventure.
Thanks for joining us, where we try to discuss relevant topics and gain a little bit of understanding and get better every day. We don't have it all figured out, but we figure we can all figure it out together.
So Trav, today we're talking about The Power of Habit, so by Charles Duhigg, and I know we've read this book prior to this, but I want you to get into it a little bit and give us the premise and some of your thoughts so far.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite books of when I read it. It's now been a little bit, but I absolutely loved it. And he's talking about how the habit wheel of what we do and how that shapes and controls our life. And what I really like that he goes into is talking about how more things are habits in our life that we realize, that more things that we do are actually kind of on autopilot.
Yeah.
And then there's some really, really key measures that we can look at to shaping these habits and then shaping our life. And so I like that it's starting small. It's finding these really, really small cues and then building on them and then having them affect what he subtitles what we do in life and do in business. And that can have positive effects through the rest of that. So
Yeah.
it's really, really exciting. So I love the way he intros this book, and it's with a very, very interesting study and research on a man to where he gets a viral infection and it makes his way into his brainstem and actually starts causing damage into the core parts of his brain, and so it starts to affect his memory. But here they still have a patient with most of his brain intact, but with very core functional parts now that are not working properly. So he then becomes this major course of study for studying him, because they are seeing how now one specific part of the brain has been affected, which has affecting his memory. And so he would always think that he was younger than he was. He was always remembering stuff that was 10, 20 years ago. He wasn't forming new memories. But what was amazing, and what they were finding when they were testing and studying him, that he could still form habits. And this was a study that started to revolutionize how people thought of habits, how they realize we form habits, and where they happen in the brain. And it goes on some pretty incredible studies on how we're creatures of habit. Our lives are formed around these habits, and we can do a lot to then have them work for good for us.
I think it's a great way to say it too, is you can, knowing the habits and knowing your cue, routine, and reward, we can get into that more in detail in a sec, but understanding that and not trying to necessarily change every bad habit, but just understanding you just need to make small tweaks, because Charles Duhigg talked about, you can't, once you have a habit, you can never get rid of that habit. You can just tweak it, but having the knowledge and understanding that these exist, what they are, and the details of them give you at least the power to then make the decisions, and it's all about knowing beforehand. So talk a little bit more, because I think that study was really interesting, but talk more about the details.
So these stories were pretty incredible, where he had all of these patterns and these habits that he built in his life up to that point, and they sent him home, and here he can't really remember anything new, but he would leave his house and he would go on walks all the time. And so they would actually still study him while he was at his house.
Yeah.
And they used to have people approach him while he was on his walks. And they'd walk up to him and they'd ask him where he lived. And he would tell them that he didn't know. And then after he proceeded to tell them that, he would start walking again and walk up to his front porch and walk into his house.
Yeah.
So it was this incredible disconnect in his brain between what he consciously could observe and understand versus what was ingrained into habitual formations into what his actions were. So he would consistently, his health started to decline because he would consistently eat poorly, because he would forget that he actually ate before. So then he would be consistently going back to the fridge and eating more food. So his wife would have to place salad next to him, so he would just eat and pick at it, or just replace food in the fridge with healthier options and offerings. So one of the tests that they also tried too was they had shapes that he had to turn over, and then he had to read what was on the bottom of them. And he was doing that consistently, and he didn't really understand why. And then after they had done him and kind of trained him on that, then they completely asked him to do a different series of tests where they wanted him to group the shapes. The first thing he started doing when they asked him that was he started turning them over.
Wow.
But he said he didn't know why. He just said that that's what he felt like that he would do.
Wow.
And that was he was not doing that at any point prior to them actually testing him, turning over the shapes,
Wow.
and doing it more. So they got a patient who they could study in such a pure form of what his habits were doing and how they could control them.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Versus what he could understand.
And and what we can take away from that is, one, just the brilliance of the study that they went through and could understand all these things, but correlate into our life of all the things maybe we're doing unconsciously without knowing whether they're healthy or unhealthy, but also understanding that if you just do something over enough times, you're going to unconsciously start doing them until you end up seeing the results. So having the control over that, and then that goes into, us talking about the cue, routine, and reward from there.
Yeah, I think one great point that this book is really, really trying to show is that there's nothing inherently bad about a habit. Like, we always talk about bad habits. Well, we have plenty of good habits.
Yeah.
Anything that are routines that we're doing in the morning, it's like a habit has no intention of being evil. It's just our brain is trying to put as many things on autopilot as possible.
Yeah.
Our brain has to do a lot of functions, so it's trying to gain as much ground as it can. And it's like, oh, I know I do that regularly. Cool. I'm going to put that into other parts of the brain that now doesn't need much conscious action to decide that I'm doing that. So it's knowing that we can just use that to leverage the good habits.
Yeah.
And so the golden rule of habit change, what he kind of coins, is that you can never stop a bad habit. You can only replace it with a good habit. So it's just all about altering what you're dealing with to then produce just a more desirable result. And it's not just about stopping your bad habit. You're just replacing it with a much better one. Now, how does he break down what is the habit loop? What are the cycles of habits?
So cue, routine, and reward. And this cue could be you being tired, you being hungry, just a feeling a certain way that brings up something inside of you. Maybe it's stress, and then you reach for a cigarette, or you reach for a can of chew. You eat sugary foods. You're stressing.
Gambling.
Yeah. Basically or alcohol. I mean, there's drugs. There's so many things. You plug whatever you want into this spot, but the cue is still stress. We'll use that for the example. The routine is using one of these substances or gambling, these different actions that overall would be considered negative and used in any excess.
Yeah.
And then the reward is the endorphins that bring from doing this, and then it's the effect of getting away. Just turning your brain off is really the goal. And that's why doing anything in excess can be negative. So what the golden rule then talks about, and Duhigg mentions about how if you have a gambling or a drinking problem, you can never, he basically says you never don't have one. And he mentions specifically in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. And that's the phrase they use, but it's more to say, just you never can be too safe. But so instead of being stressed, you still have that cue. But what are you going to do instead of? And that's why if you have an alcohol bottle on your countertop and you see it, you're going to be a lot more likely to reach for it. But if you don't have it in the house at all, you then have to drive somewhere to go get it. And maybe instead you put maybe a soda even. It's not necessarily about making yourself perfect, but replacing it a little bit.
Yeah.
So a lot of people maybe start drinking caffeinated beverages. So, where you have the alcohol bottle placed with a 6-pack of Coca-Cola, we'll say. So then when you're stressed, you get home from work, you reach for a Coke. And again, reaching for now a sugary drink that's not the best for you either, which I wouldn't advise, but it's still better.
So what was the study, and how did they kind of learn that this is how our brain processes habits?
The study was done from a researcher that it was all done on rats. So she actually ended up figuring a way to get 150 sensors into a rat's brain. And what this was doing is trying to figure out where is this happening in the brain? Where's these habit functioning? So they basically put a rat in a maze and had it go through the same way. So then there was a piece of food at the end of this maze that was the reward for the rat. So as it would do it, the first time was really hard. It struggled. They saw a lot of neural activity in the brain, having difficulty and a lot of kind of ups and downs, and then a huge spike at the end of it when it got the reward. And it had it do this multiple times. Basically, the idea was try to give a habit and have the rat go through the same way in the maze time after time after time. Each time, the reward, the spike in neural activity was lowered at the reward, and it was actually raised towards the beginning. So the cue was start the maze. And then it would go through, it was low because it was going through the difficult times, spike at the end. Once the habit was formed, after the cue, and I believe it was actually a bell that was rung in the beginning, the rat instantly had a spike in endorphins right after the cue because it knew exactly what to do and what was at the end result to actually it was getting a piece of food. But then in the opposite, the reward was then not a very spike in endorphins or neural activity because it already knew what it was going to get. And what that shows about us and human nature is once we form a habit, you can use the drive, maybe your Saturday drive to go get donuts or coffee or before work. You have that cue right in the morning is, oh, I'm leaving for work, I'm going to get my Starbucks coffee. And you have that spike in endorphins maybe before you even actually drink the coffee. It was just getting it because it's that habit. And that's what's just so interesting about us in general.
It's the reward is what makes these habits so enticing to us, and it's release of endorphins typically, and it's how we're processing the pleasure of these habits. And then what makes habits so powerful is we receive that endorphin rush before we receive the reward. And so mentally, we're kind of already in the loop once it just starts. And that's why you feel that pull that's so hard to get out of when you just know that it's started. And you just kind of know that you're going to be in the same habit. And you become consciously aware that that's not exactly what you want to do. But it's because of those spike of endorphins. Those, you're wanting that even before you've had it in a more deeper level. And two, I remember that the graphs specifically show that the mental activity is lowering when these rats are making it through the maze because it's moving as many of these processes into a much more kind of automated brain function. So then your brain just doesn't have to exert effort in these habits, and it just kind of all ends up working against you in these bad habits. But I think this is just a great way to know that now you can leverage it for a good habit. Yeah, definitely. And then it reminds me of also Charles talks about a specific example in his own life of how he ended up gaining weight because at 3 p.m. every day he'd go up to the snack room and eat a cookie. And he said every single day, so 5 days a week, he's going up at 3 p.m. eating a cookie because he's having the cue of having a break at 3. And then he goes up to the break room because that's just what they do during that time that he has to just rest and relax. And then he eats it, that's part of the routine. And then the reward is him getting that good feeling from eating the cookie. And he says basically from this, it's not a good habit because he's gained weight, it's sugary. But he just says no matter what he can do, he just couldn't stop it. He said he even put a sticky note on his computer saying, "Don't eat a cookie," and he said he still would. He said, and that's he talks about willpower. We can talk about that later if you want. But the idea that the habit was already formed, and so he realized, okay, I can't get rid of this habit, but I at least can change it.
So he looks at it and figured out, okay, what's the cue? Well, there's a break at 3 p.m. and they go up to the lunchroom, and he said the routine is go up there, talk with his fellow coworkers, and eat a cookie while they're there. And then there's a reward, and then he goes back to work, and it's all good. So he decided that instead of going up to the lunchroom, where there's always things to eat, why doesn't he just go to a different coworker's desk, and he specifically says gossip for 20 minutes. And that's now his new routine, but he still gets the reward of having a break and getting a spike in endorphins, because he just said they enjoyed talking and getting that fellowship. So he said he then ended up doing that, but he was just swapping out the routine.
Yeah.
Same cue, same reward, but instead of now going upstairs to talk with his friends, he goes to their desk to talk to them, same time of day. And he then said specifically from then he lost weight and felt better about himself, and knew that even though he was still forming a habit, it's not necessarily a good one, but it wasn't a bad one, and he's getting rid of a bad one. So I thought that was interesting, coming directly from the author about what his experience was.
My experience with that golden rule is very, very much true, to where it's just you have to replace that habit. So a long time ago, I used to bite my nails, and it just kind of becomes this gross and frustrating habit, and then you just don't, it doesn't feel good, and it was like, why am I doing this? And so it was like, it becomes this automatic thing, and the only way that I got out of it was just the pleasure of having my nails cut. I just replaced with always keeping, for a time, fingernail clippers on me, to where I could just replace just cutting my fingernails instead of biting them, but I needed to have it accessible at the time. And now I can't imagine ever biting my nails.
Yeah.
And so I have to, like, it's now something that I'm constantly aware of, is keeping them clipped. But I had to just replace the routine. And that's what he talks about, is you're technically getting the same reward, because you're still achieving practically the same action, and your brain is perceiving it as the same reward, but you're just changing what in the middle of the routine is. And then secondly, with drinking coffee, I wanted to draw back on drinking coffee. It was really acidic. It was just kind of upsetting my throat and stomach. But I just realized that when I just said, I'm going to stop drinking coffee, it almost was like I started drinking more. It was like, almost like all of a sudden my brain was like pushing into it, still wanted that.
Wow.
So all I did, and I even kind of unknowingly did this, but I just switched to tea. And then would just drink tea, and then would still get some of the caffeinated effects, just not nearly as much, and still get the pleasure of a warm drink. Then it turned into, I realized that there was a time where on my free time, when I was at home on the weekends, I wasn't drinking any coffee. When that was like a part of my routine that I had to do. But it was just because I just altered the routine behavior. And then when I had the free moment, my brain wasn't automatically desiring that it needed that reward. Yeah, I think it speaks really true. And I think it's those small things that we can get hung up on, that we can get frustrated with ourselves, that we can't change. But it's just realizing, what's a more productive thing that I can now spend my actual routine doing. Do you have any specific small habits or routines that you've seen this power play out in?
I felt a lull in the afternoons, and I was a little bit tired, and so I'd have a second cup of coffee in the afternoon, even though I really didn't want to. Like, I tried really hard because I didn't want over a certain amount of caffeine every day, and I tried just drinking coffee in the mornings.
Yeah.
But there was still that time, the trough in the day that we've talked about when it comes to the when of the day.
Yeah.
So the trough was real, and I have lower energy levels, but I still need to perform. And I wouldn't be as efficient as I needed to be, and I didn't like it. So I would reach for coffee when I was tired, and I beat myself up every time. So I just keep tea at work, and it's kind of like the same thing you're saying. It's more the idea of having something different to drink than just water, and having something warm too.
Yep.
Yeah. So
it's more pleasurable than just drinking a glass of water.
It is. It feels like a treat. So there is the reward, and I feel the reward right when I put the hot water in the tea.
Yep.
And just having it there sometimes too is just knowing it's accessible. And I believe it's so few milligrams of caffeine, especially compared to coffee. I think it was 20 and opposed to 120.
Yeah.
So for me, and I don't do it every day, but I know it's there, and that brings me joy, and I definitely feel better in the afternoons. And then afterwards, after I do it, I don't feel bad about drinking tea.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us as we try and get a little bit of wisdom every day.
We would love to hear from you guys. What ways do you become smarter and stretch your understanding? We love sharing with you, and we want to hear your comments and what you want to hear more of as well. Do you like us reading these books and sharing the summaries with you and talking about what our life experiences are? So post down below, and we look forward to hearing from you guys soon.
Hopefully we can share some of these things, we can get better, and we can enlighten ourselves and the world around us.